I'll never forget the day my life changed completely. It was a Tuesday like any other, and I was cleaning Mrs. Cordelia Vanderbilt's mansion, as I had been doing for 5 years. The smell of cleaning products permeated the air as I scrubbed the marble floor of the main room. It was then that I heard the sound of Mrs. Vanderbilt's expensive heels echoing down the hallway. She entered the room, her expensive perfume momentarily replacing the scent of disinfectant. "Maria," she said, her tone falsely sweet, "I have a special invitation for you." I stood up, straightening my threadbare uniform, intrigued and a little apprehensive. Mrs. Vanderbilt had never given me more than brief orders. "I'm organizing a gala ball this Saturday," she continued, her eyes twinkling in a way that made me uncomfortable, "and I'd like you to attend as a guest." I was stunned, unable to process what I was hearing. I, Maria de Silva, a cleaner, invited to a gala ball at the Vanderbilt mansion? It seemed too absurd to be true. "But, ma'am," I stammered, "I don't have the right clothes for." She interrupted me with a wave of her hand. "Don't worry about that. I'll arrange everything. I want you to experience what it's like to be on the other side, if only for one night." As she walked away, leaving me stunned in the middle of the glittering room, I couldn't help feeling that something was wrong. Mrs. Vanderbilt's sudden kindness was as out of character as a penguin in the desert. Little did I know that this invitation would be the beginning of a journey that would change not only my life, but the lives of everyone around me. An adventure that would take me from the depths of humiliation to the heights of triumph, and teach me the true meaning of courage, dignity, and the power of being true to yourself. That night, lying in my bed in the small apartment I shared with my teenage daughter, I couldn't sleep. Mrs. Vanderbilt's invitation was spinning around in my mind like a mad carousel. Little did I know that it would only be the first of many sleepless nights to come, as my world turned upside down. The days following Mrs. Vanderbilt's invitation passed like a blur. My cleaning routine continued, but now there was a palpable tension in the air every time I crossed paths with my boss. Her enigmatic smile made me increasingly uneasy. On Thursday, 2 days before the ball, Mrs. Vanderbilt took me to an exclusive boutique downtown. I'd never seen so many zeros on price tags before. "Choose whatever you like, Maria," she said, her tone falsely generous. "Tonight, you'll be a princess." Hesitantly, I ran my fingers through fabrics that seemed to be made of clouds and dreams. A saleswoman looked me up and down, her nose twitching slightly. "Perhaps something more suitable for you," she suggested, guiding me to a less extravagant section. I felt my face burn with embarrassment, but Mrs. Vanderbilt intervened. "No, no. Show her your best dresses. Cost is no object." I ended up choosing a sapphire blue dress that looked as if it had been sewn from the night sky itself. When I tried it on, for a moment I didn't recognize myself in the mirror. It was as if someone else was looking back at me. That night, I told my daughter, Louisa, everything. "Mom, this doesn't make sense," she said, her eyes full of concern. "Why would Mrs. Vanderbilt do that? She's never been nice to you before." I sighed, hugging my daughter. "I know, sweetheart. But maybe she's trying to change. What if it's a real opportunity? I can't waste it." Louisa didn't seem convinced, and to be honest, I wasn't either. But something inside me pushed me to go ahead. The day before the ball, while I was cleaning the huge chandeliers in the dining room, I heard Mrs. Vanderbilt talking on the phone in her office. "Yes, everything is ready," she laughed, her voice barely contained with excitement. "Tomorrow night, everyone will see the true place of a cleaning lady, no matter what clothes she wears." My heart sank. My suspicions were correct. This was a trap. For a moment, I considered not going, faking an illness, anything to avoid what would surely be a public humiliation. But then, looking at my distorted reflection in the crystal chandelier, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a spark of determination in my eyes. If Mrs. Vanderbilt wanted a show, I would give her a show, but not the kind she expected. I descended the stairs, my mind already formulating a plan. I would go to this ball, yes, but not as the helpless victim that Mrs. Vanderbilt imagined. I would go with my head held high, ready to face whatever she had planned. Little did I know that the following night would not only change my life, but would also reveal long-buried secrets in the Vanderbilt family, triggering a series of events that no one could have predicted. As I prepared for bed that night, a mixture of fear and excitement bubbled up in my stomach. Tomorrow's ball would only be the beginning of a journey that would take me to places I had never imagined, both literally and figuratively. The day of the ball arrived, bringing with it a mixture of anxiety and determination that consumed me inside. I spent the morning cleaning the mansion as usual, watching the frantic preparations for the party. Every flower arrangement, every crystal goblet seemed to mock me, reminding me of how out of place I would be that night. At 6 p.m., I left early to get ready. At home, Louisa helped me with my hair and makeup, her deft hands transforming my tired face into something I barely recognized. "You look beautiful, Mom," she said, her eyes shining with pride and concern. "Show them who you really are." I put on the stunning sapphire blue dress, feeling the soft fabric slide over my skin. For a moment, I allowed myself to dream that I really was a guest, not a piece in a cruel game. I arrived at the Vanderbilt mansion at 8 p.m. sharp. The chauffeur, Mrs. Vanderbilt, had since seemed surprised to see me, but maintained a polite silence throughout the journey. As I entered the ballroom, I was immediately enveloped by a world of opulence that I knew only as a spectator. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden light over the elegantly dressed guests, their laughter and conversation filling the air along with the soft music of a small orchestra. For a moment, I was paralyzed, feeling like an intruder. But then I remembered my resolution. I straightened my shoulders and walked into the party with my head held high. The stares started almost immediately. First, curious, then, as they recognized me, shocked and amused. I heard whispers behind fans and champagne glasses. "Isn't that the cleaning lady? What's she doing here? Cordelia's really outdone herself this time." I ignored them as best I could, making my way to the bar. It was then that I saw Mrs. Vanderbilt approaching, a fake smile on her face. "Maria, darling, how nice of you to come," she exclaimed, loud enough for everyone around to hear. "Come, let me introduce you to some friends." She led me through the hall, stopping at various groups. Each introduction was a veiled humiliation. "This is Maria, my maid. Isn't she lovely tonight? You can hardly tell she spends her days scrubbing my toilets." The laughter that followed was like stabs. But I kept my composure, smiling politely and even making a few witty remarks that seemed to surprise the guests. It was during one of these presentations that I noticed something strange. An older man, whom Mrs. Vanderbilt introduced as Mr. Hawthorne, looked at me with an expression of shock that had nothing to do with my unusual presence at the party. "I'm sorry," he stammered, "but you look remarkably like someone I knew a long time ago." Before I could reply, Mrs. Vanderbilt abruptly interrupted us, dragging me away. But I could feel Mr. Hawthorne's eyes following me around the room. The evening continued, a surreal mixture of glamour and humiliation. But as the hours passed, I realized that not everyone was laughing at me. Some guests seemed genuinely interested in meeting me, impressed by my resilience in the face of Mrs. Vanderbilt's treatment. Little did I know that that night would not only test my strength, but also trigger a series of events that would reveal long-buried secrets and change the course of many lives, including my own. As the party reached its climax, I couldn't have imagined that my real challenge was yet to come, and that before the night was over, I would discover a shocking truth that would turn my world upside down. The party was still in full swing, but I needed a moment to breathe. I slipped out into the mansion's gardens, a labyrinth of roses and marble statues bathed in moonlight. The fresh night air was a welcome relief after the stifling atmosphere of the hall. I walked along the winding paths, letting the scent of the flowers calm my shaken nerves. It was then that I heard voices coming from a nearby gazebo. I immediately recognized Mrs. Vanderbilt's high-pitched tone. "You have to get rid of her, Cordelia," said a male voice I didn't recognize. "She's getting dangerously close to the truth." Instinctively, I hid behind a bush, my heart racing. "Don't be ridiculous, Charles," replied Mrs. Vanderbilt. "She's just an ignorant cleaner. What could she possibly find out? Did you see the way old Hawthorne looked at her? He recognized her, I'm sure. If he makes the connection—" "He won't," interrupted Mrs. Vanderbilt, her voice as sharp as ice. I'll take care of it. Besides, she'll soon be so humiliated that she'll never dare show her face here again. I could hardly breathe. What were they talking about? What truth was I about to discover? When they left the gazebo, I crept further into the shadows. But in my haste, I bumped into a vase, which fell and shattered on the stone floor. "Who's there?" shouted Mrs. Vanderbilt. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I considered running, but something inside me rebelled against the idea of hiding like a criminal. I stepped out of the shadows, facing their surprised gazes. "Maria?" Mrs. Vanderbilt looked shocked. "What are you doing here?" I. I was just getting some air," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. The party was a bit overwhelming. The man next to her, who I vaguely recognized as the family lawyer, looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and fear. "How much did you hear?" he demanded. "Nothing," I lied, surprised at my own audacity. "I just got here." Mrs. Vanderbilt studied me for a long moment, her cold eyes calculating something I couldn't understand. "Well," she finally said, her tone falsely cheerful, "we can't have our guest of honor missing all the fun, can we? Let's get back to the party." As she led me back into the hall, her grip on my arm was almost painful. I realized that I had stumbled into something much bigger and more dangerous than simple social humiliation. Back at the party, I noticed Mr. Hawthorne watching me from afar, his expression a mixture of recognition and confusion. When our gazes met, he made a point of approaching, but Mrs. Vanderbilt quickly stepped between us. "I think it's about time we had a toast to our special guest, don't you, Maria?" she announced, her voice echoing through the hall. My stomach contracted. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the culmination of her trap. But now, armed with the knowledge that there was much more at stake than my pride, I was determined not to fall for it. As Mrs. Vanderbilt raised her glass, preparing for what was sure to be a humiliating speech, I prepared for the battle of my life. Little did I know that tonight's revelations were only the beginning of a journey that would lead me to discover shocking truths about my past and that of the Vanderbilt family. The clink of a spoon against a crystal goblet silenced the room. All eyes turned to Mrs. Vanderbilt, who stood in the center of the room, her mischievous smile barely contained. "Dear friends," she began, her honeyed voice echoing through the room, "tonight, we have a very special guest with us." I felt the weight of the stares on me, some curious, others disdainful. I forced myself to stand up straight, my chin raised in silent defiance. "Maria has been my housekeeper for years," Mrs. Vanderbilt continued, "and I thought it would be educational for her to experience how the people she serves so diligently live." Muffled laughter echoed through the room. I felt my face burn, but I refused to lower my gaze. "So, let's make a toast to Maria," she raised her glass. "May she always remember her true place, no matter what clothes she wears or what company she frequents." It was at that moment that something inside me snapped. The words I heard in the garden, the look in Mr. Hawthorne's eyes, everything merged into a wave of courage I didn't know I possessed. I stepped forward, picking up a glass of champagne from a nearby tray. "Thank you, Mrs. Vanderbilt," I said, my voice surprisingly firm. "Since we're giving toasts, I'd like to propose one myself." A murmur of surprise went through the room. Mrs. Vanderbilt seemed to have been struck by lightning. "To all of us," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "to those who were born in a cradle of gold and those who had to fight for every penny. Because in the end, what really matters is not what we wear or how much money we have, but how we treat each other." I saw some people nod in approval, others looked uncomfortable. Mr. Hawthorne looked at me with a mixture of admiration and something else I couldn't decipher. "And a special toast to Mrs. Vanderbilt," I added, looking directly at her, "for giving me this opportunity to show that dignity and character are priceless." A stunned silence fell over the hall, broken only by the sound of a few people applauding hesitantly. Mrs. Vanderbilt seemed to have swallowed something bitter, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Before she could react, Mr. Hawthorne approached me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My dear," he said, his voice trembling, "I need to talk to you. In private." Mrs. Vanderbilt tried to intervene, but Mr. Hawthorne ignored her, gently guiding me out of the hall. As we left, I could feel the gazes of the guests following us, the party now forgotten in the face of this new drama. In the hallway, away from prying ears, Mr. Hawthorne held my hands, his eyes scanning my face as if searching for something. You look exactly like her," he murmured. "Tell me, Maria, did you know your mother?" I was stunned by the question. "No, sir. She passed away when I was very young." He nodded, as if confirming something. "Maria, what I'm about to tell you will change your life forever. Are you ready to hear it?" My heart was beating frantically. Something told me I was about to discover a secret that Mrs. Vanderbilt desperately wanted to keep hidden. "Yes," I answered, my voice just a whisper. "I'm ready." Little did I know that the words Mr. Hawthorne was about to utter would set in motion a series of events that would not only change my life, but shake the foundations of the Vanderbilt family and reveal decades of buried secrets. Mr. Hawthorne guided me to a small library adjacent to the main hall. The scent of old books and leather filled my senses as he closed the door behind us, isolating us from the hubbub of the party. "Maria," he began, his voice quivering with emotion, "30 years ago, I was the personal attorney for the late Mr. Vanderbilt, Cordelia's father. He had a secret, one that Cordelia would do anything to keep buried." My heart raced. What secret? Mr. Vanderbilt was having an affair with one of the maids in the house, a young woman called Elena. The name struck me like a thunderbolt. Elena was my mother's name. "They fell in love," continued Mr. Hawthorne, "and from that love, a child was born, a little girl." My legs went weak, and I leaned on a nearby armchair. "Are you saying that I—" "Yes, Maria. You're Mr. Vanderbilt's illegitimate daughter, Cordelia's half-sister." The world seemed to spin around me. Flashes of memory flooded my mind. Mrs. Vanderbilt's scornful gaze, her constant cruelty, the way she always seemed to look at me with a mixture of hatred and fear. But how? Why was I brought up as a stranger? Why didn't my mother ever tell me? Mr. Hawthorne sighed heavily. "Cordelia found out about the affair. She threatened to expose everything, to ruin the family's reputation. Mr. Vanderbilt, fearing the scandal, agreed to send Elena away with a substantial sum of money to look after you. He intended to recognize you legally when you came of age, but he died before that," I concluded, remembering the stories about the car accident that took the life of the Vanderbilt patriarch. "Exactly. And Cordelia did everything to keep that secret buried. I imagine it came as a shock to her when you turned up years later, looking for a job as a cleaner in her father's own house. The irony of the situation was almost too painful to bear. All my life, working as a servant in the house that, by rights, should have been my home. Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, still trying to process everything. "Because I can't carry this secret any longer," replied Mr. Hawthorne, "and because you deserve to know the truth about where you came from. Besides," he added, taking an envelope from his jacket, "there's this." He handed me the envelope. Inside, I found a letter, yellowed by time, in the elegant handwriting I recognized from the framed documents in the mansion. "A letter from your father, written shortly before his death. He knew something might happen to him and wanted to make sure you knew the truth." With trembling hands, I began to read the letter. The words of a father I had never met, expressing his love for my mother and me, his regret at not having been brave enough to acknowledge us publicly, and his wish that one day I would understand and forgive his choices. Tears streamed down my face as I finished reading. Mr. Hawthorne placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "What do you intend to do now, Maria?" I wiped away the tears, a new determination rising within me. "I'm going to confront Cordelia. It's time for the truth to come out, no matter what the consequences." Little did I know that this confrontation would trigger a series of events that would not only change my life, but would shake the foundations of high society and reveal even darker secrets of the Vanderbilt family. With my father's letter firmly in my hand and Mr. Hawthorne at my side, I walked back to the main hall. My heart was beating frantically, but my resolve was unshakable. It was time to face Cordelia and reveal the truth she had tried so desperately to hide. As we entered the hall, the guests' curious gazes turned to us. The music stopped abruptly, and a tense silence filled the room. Cordelia stood in the center of the room, a glass of champagne in her hand, her face a mask of false serenity. "Cordelia," I called, my voice firmer than I expected. "We need to talk." She turned to me, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "Maria, darling, I think you've caused enough of a stir for one night. Maybe it's time you went home." "No," I replied, stepping forward. "It's time everyone knew the truth." A murmur went through the crowd. Cordelia tried to keep her composure, but I could see the panic growing in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she hissed, her fake smile faltering. I held up the letter. "I'm talking about this. A letter from your father, my father." The silence that followed was deafening. Cordelia paled, her mask of control finally breaking. "It's a lie," she stammered, looking around frantically. "She's delirious. Someone call security." But no one moved. All eyes were fixed on the two of us, the drama unfolding like a bizarre play. "It's not a lie, Cordelia," Mr. Hawthorne intervened, his voice calm but firm. "I was there. I knew everything." Cordelia turned to him, her eyes blazing with fury. You old traitor." "No more lies," I said, my voice echoing through the hall. "For years, you've treated me like dirt, humiliated me, tried to break me. But now I understand. It wasn't just cruelty. It was fear. Fear that the truth would come out, that your precious status would be threatened." The guests whispered among themselves, some shocked, others fascinated by the drama that was unfolding. Cordelia, seeing that she was losing control of the situation, changed tactics. She forced a laugh, although her eyes remained cold. "That's ridiculous. Even if it were true, which it isn't, you have no proof. No court would recognize." "It's not about courts or money," I interrupted. "It's about truth, about justice, finally understanding who I am and where I come from." Just then, an elderly voice sounded from the back of the room. "I can confirm her story." Everyone turned to see an elderly woman, whom I recognized as Mrs. Peterson, the mansion's retired housekeeper. "I was there," she continued, her voice shaky but determined. "I saw it all happen. The love between Mr. Vanderbilt and Elena, Maria's birth, Cordelia's threat, everything." The hall erupted in a chaos of voices. Cordelia looked as if she had been struck by lightning, her face a mixture of shock and defeat. As the commotion grew around us, I realized that this was only the beginning. The truth was finally coming out, but the consequences of this revelation would be far more far-reaching and unpredictable than I could have imagined. The ballroom had turned into pandemonium. Guests were shouting and arguing, some demanding explanations, others simply too shocked to react. At the center of it all, Cordelia seemed to have aged years in a matter of minutes, her face a mask of defeat and fury. "You've ruined everything," she hissed at me, her eyes sparking with hatred. "Everything I've worked for, everything I've built." Before I could reply, she turned abruptly and ran out of the room. Something in her gaze alarmed me. "We need to follow her," I said to Mr. Hawthorne. "I have a bad feeling about this." We ran after Cordelia, leaving the chaos of the party behind. We followed the sound of her heels echoing through the halls of the mansion until we reached the main office. When we entered, the scene we found chilled my blood. Cordelia was standing behind the large oak desk, a gun in her trembling hands. "Don't come any closer," she shouted, her voice raspy. "You don't understand. I did all this to protect the family legacy, to keep our reputation intact." "Cordelia," I said softly, taking a cautious step towards her. "It doesn't have to be like this. We can sort this out together." She laughed bitterly. "Work it out? How? Do you think you can just show up and claim everything that's mine? That you can destroy everything I've built?" "I don't want to destroy anything," I replied, my heart racing. "I just wanted the truth. I wanted to understand who I am." For a moment, I saw a glimmer of vulnerability in Cordelia's eyes. "You don't understand," she muttered. "I've spent my whole life trying to be the perfect daughter, trying to prove myself. And then you come along, the daughter he really loved." The revelation hit me like a punch. All the hatred, all the cruelty. Was it jealousy? Was it jealousy? Insecurity? It's not too late, I insisted. We can start again. As sisters. The words seemed to hang in the air between us. Cordelia hesitated, the gun trembling in her hands. Just then, we heard sirens in the distance. Someone must have called the police. It's over, said Mr. Hawthorne gently. It's time to face the truth, Cordelia. With a sob, Cordelia dropped the gun. I ran to hug her, and to my surprise, she didn't resist. We stood there, two sisters united for the first time, as the sound of sirens drew closer. The next few minutes were a blur. The police stormed the mansion, guests were questioned, and Cordelia was taken away to give evidence. I stayed behind, stunned by everything that had happened. Mr. Hawthorne put a comforting hand on my shoulder. This is just the beginning, Maria. The legal battle to come will be intense. I nodded, aware that my life had changed irrevocably. The truth had been exposed, but the consequences of this revelation were only just beginning to unfold. As I watched the police search the mansion, I couldn't help but wonder, what did the future hold for me now? And how would this revelation affect not only my life, but that of everyone around me? The days following the night of the party were a whirlwind of emotions and events. I woke up the next morning in my small apartment, almost convinced that it had all been a bizarre dream. But reality was soon present in the form of incessant phone calls and reporters camped out in front of my building. Louisa, my daughter, was in shock. Mom, does this mean we're rich now? I sighed, hugging her. I don't know, sweetheart. Things are much more complicated than simply being rich or poor. And complicated they were. Over the next few days, I was dragged from one law office to another. Mr. Vanderbilt's will was being contested. There were questions about the legitimacy of my claim, and the press was having a field day with the modern Cinderella story. Cordelia, after her collapse on the night of the party, was reclusive in a nursing home. Part of me wanted to visit her, to try to build some kind of relationship, but another part was afraid. Decades of resentment don't disappear overnight. A week after the revelation, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Mr. Hawthorne. Maria, I need you to come to the mansion immediately. We found something disturbing. Intrigued and apprehensive, I made my way to the Vanderbilt mansion. It was strange to walk through the front door, to be treated like a guest instead of a maid. Mr. Hawthorne was waiting for me in the main office, his face grave. Maria, while we were going through Mr. Vanderbilt's documents, we found this. He handed me a folder. Inside were documents detailing suspicious financial transactions, all linked to Cordelia. Embezzlement, bribery, even evidence of blackmail. It seems that Cordelia had been involved in illegal activities for years, explained Mr. Hawthorne. She used the family name and influence for her own gains. I felt my stomach turn. What does this mean for the company? For the family legacy? It means we're on the brink of an even bigger scandal, he replied darkly. And you, as the rightful heir, will have to decide how to deal with it. The responsibility fell on my shoulders like a crushing weight. I, who only a few days ago was just a cleaner, was now at the center of a web of lies, crimes, and family secrets. What should I do? I asked, more to myself than to Mr. Hawthorne. He put a gentle hand on my shoulder. You'll have to decide, Maria. Expose everything and potentially destroy the Vanderbilt empire, or try to cover up Cordelia's crimes and preserve the family legacy. It's not an easy decision. I looked out of the office window, observing the mansion's impeccable gardens. All this could be mine now, but at what cost? And what would be the price of doing the right thing? As I pondered these questions, I realized that my journey was far from over. In fact, it seemed that the real challenge had only just begun. The days following the discovery of the incriminating documents were a whirlwind of meetings, legal consultations, and sleepless nights. I found myself torn between the desire for justice and the responsibility I felt towards the Vanderbilt legacy. A legacy that, until recently, I didn't even know was mine. One particularly tense afternoon, I decided to visit Cordelia at the nursing home. I found her sitting by the window, looking much smaller and more fragile than I remembered. Have you come to gloat? She asked, her voice devoid of its usual acidity. No, I replied softly. I came because we need to talk. About what you've done, about the future of the company. Her eyes widened slightly. You know, I nodded. I nodded. I know everything, Cordelia. The embezzlement, the blackmail. Why? She let out a bitter laugh. Why? Because I was never enough. Not for our father, not for society. I had to prove my worth somehow. I felt a pang of compassion, mixed with frustration. But at the expense of others? At the expense of the family's integrity? What are you going to do? She asked, finally facing me directly. I took a deep breath. I haven't decided yet. That's why I'm here. I want to understand. I want to know if there's anything to be saved in this situation. Our conversation went on for hours. Cordelia, for the first time, truly opened up, revealing years of insecurity, pressure, and wrong decisions. It wasn't a justification for her actions, but it helped me better understand the puzzle that was my newfound family. As I left the clinic, my mind was in turmoil. But one thing was clear. I could not and would not cover up Cordelia's crimes. The next day, I called a meeting with the board of directors of Vanderbilt Enterprises. Mr. Hawthorne was at my side, offering silent support. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice trembling slightly. I have information that will profoundly affect the future of this company. Over the next few minutes, I laid it all out. The documents, the illegal transactions, everything. The shock was palpable in the room. As the rightful heir of Theodore Vanderbilt, I continued, I take responsibility for righting these wrongs. We will cooperate fully with the authorities, reimburse all injured parties, and restructure the company from scratch, if necessary. The chaos that followed was intense. Some board members were shouting, others seemed to be in shock, but I stood firm. In the following weeks, the storm I had unleashed swept across the corporate world. Vanderbilt Enterprises suffered, shares plummeted, and I found myself at the center of a media hurricane. But there was also unexpected support. Employees came out to praise the decision to clean up the company. Business partners, impressed by the transparency, offered support during the restructuring. One evening, exhausted after another long day of depositions and meetings, I received a message from Cordelia. You did the right thing, something I never had the courage to do. Looking out the window of my new office in the Vanderbilt Tower, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought me there. From cleaning lady to CEO, from outsider to heiress, from victim to agent of change. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could turn the Vanderbilt legacy into something I could truly be proud of. The months that followed my decision to expose the truth were a test of endurance, determination, and character. Vanderbilt Enterprises was in upheaval, and I found myself having to learn the intricacies of the corporate world practically overnight. But I wasn't alone. Louisa, my daughter, became my rock. Her youthful perspective and sharp intelligence were invaluable as I navigated this new world. Mom, she said to me one evening as we were going over some documents, you're building something new here, something better. Her words gave me strength on the hardest days. Mr. Hawthorne continued to be an invaluable mentor, guiding me through the legal and corporate mazes. Together, we began to implement radical changes in the company. We instituted unprecedented transparency policies. We created corporate social responsibility programs that really made a difference in the communities where we operated. Slowly but steadily, we began to rebuild the reputation of Vanderbilt Enterprises. One of the most surprising moments came when I decided to visit the company's main plant. The employees, many of whom I knew from my days as a cleaner, greeted me with applause. "You're one of us," said an old worker, tears in his eyes. "You understand." It was at that moment that I realized my experience as a cleaner was not a handicap. It was my greatest strength. I understood the struggles of ordinary workers in a way that no previous CEO ever could. Meanwhile, my relationship with Cordelia remained complicated but evolving. She had pleaded guilty to several charges and was serving